Morning or afternoon. Today is December 9th, 2022, Friday, and it is a truly great pleasure for me to have with me three experts on labor markets and macro labor markets, especially to talk with me about inflation in the labor market. So what I want to do today is just simply go around the room, the three experts here: Harry Holzer, professor at Georgetown University; Pierre Cahuc, who's a professor at Sciences Po in Paris; and Michael Burda, who is professor at Humboldt University in Berlin. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Let me start off asking Harry Holzer, why is this inflation happening now?
Well, I think, as is usual, the case among economists, we think about in terms of everything in terms of supply and demand, and there are both supply and demand reasons. Certainly in the U.S. and I imagine abroad as well. We have demand side inflation because simply the classic case of too many dollars chasing too few goods. I think most economists believe that both fiscal and monetary policy in the U.S. Were overstimulative and were in place too long before the government and the Fed started cutting back. So that's sort of a more classical kind of demand-driven inflation, but we also have supply-side problems, of which there are two or three. Number one, the supply chain problems, which seem to be becoming less severe, but those made goods in short supply and more expensive. Secondly, of course, the Ukraine war and what it did to both food and energy prices. And then, of course, my interest, and Dan, yours and my interest, the labor market. The labor market in the United States has been very unusual the last few years. Shortages of workers, job vacancy rates twice as high as unemployment rates. We never believed we'd see that. Driven by, I think, a lot of different forces. Too few workers in the labor force, workers being choosier when they are in the labor force, all of which driving up wages and therefore prices. So I think there's a lot of different sources of this inflation, which in some sense makes it more challenging to deal with. But that's how I see it in the U.S.
I'm an old man. Michael, you're not quite so old a man. Can you analogize this to anything we've had in the past?
Well,
or is it too generous?
When I was growing up in the 1970s, I got interested in economics because of the rising and sustained high rate of inflation that we observed back then. And even back then, of course, there was a dispute among the academics, but also among practitioners, whether it was due to just simply the U.S. economy overheating or whether there's some key prices that had moved, prompting everyone to try to get a piece of the pie. And back then, labor unions were more, important in the United States than they are today. But even in Germany, where I currently live, German trade unions were so strong that they actually asked for real wage increases in the aftermath of these big price shocks, because in the 1970s, the price of oil jumped by 250, 300%. And this was a huge hit to Americans, but also to Europeans. Europeans import much more gasoline, petroleum products than the United States does, or did back then. The United States is now more energy self-sufficient. But the analogy is really clear to me, except now, at least in Germany, the unions are no longer as strong as they were in the 1970s. So the real wage hit that the United States took in the 1970s is actually being observed right now, and the government's under a lot of pressure to somehow spread the loss so that common, sort of normal low-paid workers don't take the whole hit, and that pensioners don't take a hit. So it's a really fascinating replay of the 70s for Germany, at least. Yeah, but the government, of course, is responding in a very sort of European fashion, trying to sort of spread the pain around, so we all sort of suffer a little bit.
Peter, let me ask you this, okay? We've had this tremendous inflation for the last year. It seems to have slowed down in the U.S. My question is, do you expect it will slow down some more in the U.S. and in Europe? Or is this going to be built into sort of a wage price spiral, a term out of the 1950s that we used to use? What do you think, Pierre?
Oh, as Harry said, I mean, there are many, many reasons why we have inflation, supply side, demand side. So from that point of view, it's difficult to know. So I think that on the one hand, since the 80s, the independence of central bank has been more important than before, and so which might help to stabilize inflation. But obviously, there are huge pressure on central bank, and on the other hand, we know that the geopolitical situation is very unstable. The amount of private and public debt is very high. The price of raw material, energy, import is from low-wage countries, which are going to increase certainly in the next future. Deglobalization, if it occurs, all these fights will induce price increases, and also the energy transition will be something that will push prices up. So it depends obviously on the different weight of these different fights, which we don't know yet. So I would say, I don't know, but we know the factors, the different factors, and hopefully the war in Ukraine stops rapidly. If central bank keeps their independence, we could be quite optimistic.
Michael, come on, give me an answer.
What's the question, Dan?
My question is, I was asked to fill out a survey yesterday about what my expectation is about price inflation for the next 12 months and the 12 months after that. What would your answer be for Europe on that question?
Okay. Well, the way I tell
got the survey too, by the way.
Okay. The interesting thing is that we really did see a supply shock in Europe. I mean, the U.S. had this COVID excess demand problem. I guess I think everyone kind of agrees that too much money was pumped out and to too many people, and maybe even to the wrong people. But in Europe, the Europeans are a bit stingier, despite what you read, and yet there was this definite supply shock, and it really wasn't just oil, but it's primarily oil and, well, natural gas. That's the big one for Germany, and the one that really hurts for Germany, and maybe less for France because France has nuclear power. And you saw that in the first months of the big increase when the war started in late February. So, it's like when a snake swallows an anaconda swallows a donkey. You can actually see it going through the digestive system. It eventually disappears. If Europeans don't believe inflation will be higher, and the European Central Bank sends the right signals, that's what Pierre was saying, that expectations won't come unhinged. And I think people in Germany would get very upset if Christine Lagarde just said, we'll do an Arthur Burns on this and just let it all ride and have a higher rate of credit creation and monetary growth, and not try to slow the economy down in some systematic way. And then the end we'll have higher inflation like we did in the late 1970s. So my positive answer is, if you look at the data, what we're seeing now is the anaconda is passing through. So the 1 year on inflation rate measured month to month is going to slow down as long as gas prices and I talk about natural gas prices and gasoline prices, wood prices, grain prices start to decline. We'll actually see, we won't see a sort of these inflationary expectations becoming permanent. I'm completely convinced of that. And Europe is very integrated, so I think the excess supply we kind of had in Southern Europe is Germans will start importing more stuff from Southern Europe. The French we'll see the Germans actually showing a negative trade surplus pretty soon. In fact, it's already happened. And these are also very interesting developments that, Europe is an integrated market. So I think there's a good chance that people will not expect 8 or 9% inflation next year. I think, in fact, you asked for my own expectations, I would say 4%.
I said exactly 4% in response to this survey yesterday. So
anytime I can get close to you, Dan, I'm really happy.
No, I mean, I think that's interesting. Harry, you alluded earlier to issues of workers, okay? And this is a very complicated question. A, to what extent do you think this inflationary burden has been borne differently by income level? And B, do you think that those who have borne it more will recoup some of the losses as things slow down compared to other people?
Well, I think the distributional effects of inflation depend on exactly which prices are rising.
Right.
So since what we've seen so far are big increases in food and energy costs, and in the United States, things like housing, those are all things that poor people spend a lot of money on out of their budget. So those things would cause a higher burden on lower to middle income people. Now, of course, some of that's being reversed. So far we see energy prices declining, and they might continue to decline if the economy goes into recession around the world. So those things hurt poor people. But other sources of inflation in the U.S., the inflation has spread well beyond those sectors. Those price increases are spread more evenly. And there's one other semi-positive force at work here. In the United States, wage increases have kept up with core inflation. So you strip out food and energy, wage increases, depending on which index you look at, have risen by 5 to 6% a year, and core inflation has risen 5 to 6% a year. So it looks like workers are keeping up. If anything, they are probably contributing. But there's one other nice thing about the wage increases we've had. They have been largest at the bottom of the wage scale. The biggest increases in wages have been in leisure and hospitality, in retail, places where workers traditionally earn very low wages, and that's a good thing in some sense. So those workers, while experiencing the pain of high food and energy costs, if they are working, which not all poor people do, but if in fact they are, the higher wage increases at the bottom cushion some of those negative effects.
Let me turn to Pierre on a related thing. Pierre, you mentioned something about pensioners, I think, earlier. Now, in the United States, pensioners like me have the government pension fully indexed to the consumer price index. I get a 9% income increase on part of my income next month, which for me has got to be a real increase given the Hammermesh price index. Is this true in Europe also? I don't buy much. I buy no fuel. I buy a little bit of food. Is this true in Europe also, or have pensioners been hit by the inflation disproportionately?
Yeah, so at least in France, the pensions are indexed on price index on inflation. And also to come back on Harry's answer, in France, the minimum wage is also indexed on inflation, and more than inflation for the first quintile, the lowest quintile of income. So meaning there is these workers are very well protected, and it is even within Europe. I mean, as soon as there are more than 2 points of inflation, the minimum wage is readjusted. So from that point of view, France is that's very specific to the extent that all the low wages are indexed, also because we have this collective bargaining, where you have a mandatory annual renegotiation of wages. So in France, the redistribution effect should be very, very small. I mean, not at the detriment of the low wage workers. So from that point of view, it's a good news to learn that the US also there is this kind of evolution, even without this minimum wage. But France is very specific from that point of view, I think.
This is all very optimistic. Harry, I find it terribly hard to believe, and Michael too, that there aren't some groups that are being relatively hit more than others in this.
Oh, I definitely
the groups that I worry about politically. In Germany, for example, who are those groups, Michael?
Well, the pensioners, because in Germany the pension is always an administrative decision verified by the government, which is based on nominal wage growth, and to the extent that it covers inflation is also kind of a decision that's administrative. It's not automatic. And Germany has has bad feelings towards indexation going back to the Weimar Republic. So they don't go for the indexation. In fact, it was illegal in many contracts until recently. I think you can still put it in financial contracts. But in terms of the pension, it's a political decision, but the pension is very political. So it will match inflation, maybe not 100% of inflation, but maybe 70%. The minimum wage, however, has been aggressively instituted and increased in Germany, and the new chancellor raised it to 12 euros an hour. which is almost astronomical compared to the U.S., but it's getting close to France. In fact, I think it may, depending on how you cut it, it may actually be a little bit ahead of France. So, this is good news. What's also good news, and this is what Harry said, is that labor market tightness at the bottom because of people in hospitality and personal services and trade, retail trade have done extremely well because people don't want to work. Because of fear of disease, fear, and perhaps a bit of better treatment by the unemployment agency, the employment agencies, the job offices as we call them. There's less pressure on them to take up any old job, and that means that, and I've seen it in restaurants. The restaurant when you come visit me, Dan, we'll see how expensive restaurants have become. And I'm sure your favorite, the biggest component in Dan's price index is opera tickets, and those are absolutely astronomically high unless you have a long-term contract. So, in contrast to France, the workers don't always get an annual renegotiation. There's often 2-year overlapping contracts. So the metal workers and the public sector, I think public sector does 1 year now, but it's there's going to be a bit more, trying to keep up with the Joneses and get ahead of the Joneses.
Harry, in the 1950s and 60s, we talked in terms of what Michael is saying about leapfrogging. In other words, there's some lags in contracts, and then one group gets an increase, others get an increase, and so on and so forth. Do you see that happening here, or is that not possible in a non-union economy anymore?
Well, it's much less prevalent here because, as you know and have talked about, private sector unionism is only 6% in the United States, and more broadly, you don't see this kind of longer contracts in the non-union sector that enable that to happen. So I think here the forces driving wages are more market. Things are more market driven, and as I said, as Michael just said, the unwillingness of workers to accept jobs that in the past were acceptable, and whether that's because of a fear of COVID, certainly among people of the older workers, or people deciding they like being at home and don't want to have to drive to work every day, or just there's a group of people I think that got burnt out. The essential workers got burnt out and were angry during COVID about a bunch of things. So those market forces I think are going to drive things here, and then of course the minimum wage is part of this story as well. Dan, as you've told us for many years, and we have this bizarre situation in the United States right now where the federal minimum wage has been stuck at a very low level, $7.25 since 2009. So you have states and even localities pushing up their own. A few of the red states, much more the blue states and cities. So you have this huge heterogeneity in terms of what minimum wages are, depending on where you live. And at the bottom, that's relevant as well. But yeah, I think of it more as market forces plus a few of these legislative forces determining where the wage increases happen or don't happen.
Can I ask you guys a question? Dan, and I'm turning the tables. What about unionism in the United States? Is there any chance it'll come back, given these? Richard Freeman always said that social media would bring back unionism. Is there any evidence of that?
There's an article in the brand new Journal of Economic Perspectives by some lefty economists at Columbia, which is pushing for all the things we can do to achieve more unions in the U.S. I'd be happy to bet that in your lifetime, forget about mine, it's too short a horizon, you're not going to see private sector unionization in the United States above 10%. Harry, you know much more than me. Is that?
I would easily take that bet. I don't think it's going to be much above 6 or 7% in the private sector. There have been some well-publicized organizing efforts in Amazon and in Starbucks. But these are, in Amazon, it's only one plant that they've successfully in Staten Island. The Starbucks shops are really tiny establishments, and I just don't see it. And the structural factors that have inhibited union growth in the United States since the mid-50s are all in place. So I think Dan's right about that. I just don't expect any major turnaround. And all the factors that enable employers to avoid unionization they can automate, they can relocate, they can turn workers into independent contractors. All of those forces will continue to exist. So I would be very surprised to see a major resurgence in the private sector.
Let me ask you here, and then we'll go around to the others say about a final question. Look, the European economy is, I think one of you noted, is quite integrated. It's not just France or Germany. And increasingly, the European economy, I'm very happy to say this, and the US economy are quite integrated. I mean, there's a lot of trade and a lot of movement of labor back and forth. Is there anything the monetary and fiscal authorities can do to try integrating policy so that some collective action might mitigate the inflation issues that are going on? Is there any hope for that in your view?
I don't know if there is hope for that, but we know there are things to do in order to try to avoid future crises that could push inflation up. So I think something which is important is to try really to complete COVID vaccination in other countries, in all countries, in order to try to avoid. We see what is going on in China, for instance, now, and it could be that we are other waves, and then this would be a very bad news for the disruption of supply chain or these kind of things. Also, we know that public debt have increased. Several countries, emerging countries, have big public debt problem. Also, having kind of fiscal stabilization with insurance provided by a large fund. So stabilization will be very important to have cooperation is in the dimension. Also trying to reinforce supply chains in order to avoid big disruption of supply chains. So there is much to do. I think that many institutions are already discussing these kind of issues. So the path is quite clear. There are some priorities. I don't know how it will happen, but I think it's clear that things can be done at the international level.
They can be done, but will they be done?
I hope so.
Michael, any thoughts on that one?
There's a lot of pressure on the European Central Bank to raise interest rates right now, and that surprisingly, the euro is turned around. It's actually up quite a bit compared. So your trip is going to be very expensive in May.
I get paid in euros by the IZA. I'm happy as a clam.
You're hedged. No, but I'm concerned that Europe may do this without coordinating with the United States, and I think this is why, like Pierre said, you don't want to have a sequence of financial crises happening because we didn't coordinate. Because what usually happens is that when Europe does this, there's a huge flow of capital to Europe, and the euro gets even stronger. And you have all sorts of some problems for countries like Turkey that have floating exchange rates and are kind of fixated on the dollar, and all of a sudden you have another. But their trade relations are with Germany and France and Italy. So it would be great to coordinate, and I think fiscal is the same thing. We need to work on coordinating other things too, because I think the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which I personally support for environmental reasons, is a huge problem for Europe. The United States is clever enough to understand that it's hard to organize a mass subsidy program because Europe doesn't have a tax system, so you can't pull a Joe Biden on European countries, and this is kind of. It's going to hurt European competitiveness, and I'm scared there might be a Smoot-Hawley response from the Europeans, and that would have an effect on all sorts of things, including inflation. But it's kind of off topic right now.
Harry, let me ask you a final question, okay? Since I know you've been involved in political things much more certainly than I have. Okay, question. No question, accelerating inflation leads to political responses. It's what I would argue brought down the Weimar Republic. It's certainly Trump did his very best to make it not happen, but it certainly helped the Republicans this last month. Okay. What do you see of that happening in the US and to a lesser extent in Europe? Or is this again the donkey coming out the other end of the anaconda?
Well, in terms of that metaphor, I'm not sure how to make the parallel. I think in the 2022 election, I think the high rates of inflation did hurt the Democrats. They were spared because of other things going on, like the Dobbs decision, eliminating the right of women to choose, the extremism on the Republican side, and threats to democracy that clearly turned off a lot of voters. So in some sense, the Democrats did well in spite of the inflation problems that they helped create, not because of them. Going forward, it's so hard to predict. I expect inflation to be tamed in the United States simply because the Federal Reserve is going to insist on it, and they're going to keep raising interest rates and perhaps cause a recession. So in 2024, in some sense, for voters, a recession might have a bigger effect than inflation rates, depending on how deep the recession is and what's the rate of recovery. But in the United States, politically, we're in such an unusual moment. We don't know if Donald Trump will be renominated by the Republicans. He certainly shakes up the whole system, especially if, as I expect, he will be indicted probably multiple times by then. The threats to democracy that have come from those sources may or may not tamp down. So at this point, the political effects may be more about recession than inflation, or maybe the combination of high interest rates and recession, but also so many major political forces at play that are really hard to predict right now. So that's my answer. Time will tell. But it's a period of unusually high uncertainty along many dimensions, I think, in the political arena. And I think, Mike and Pierre could speak to similar forces in Europe, perhaps.
Let me ask that. I mean, both in France and in Germany, if I'm not mistaken, at least parliamentary in Germany, presidential in France, elections are a long ways away. Mr. Macron has 4 more years. Mr. Schultz just became prime minister. That means he has, I think, 4 more years or 5.
Mm-hmm.
So why should any of this inflation stuff matter politically in your country? Let me go to ask Michael. We had a coup attempt, sort of, in Germany this week, trying to imitate the United States, maybe. Should I worry about politics in Germany because of inflation, or is that not an issue currently? And then let me finish up with Pierre with the same question.
Well, Dan, as you know, parliamentary democracies allow. I'm not so sure about France, but you can topple a government with the appropriate coalition and the so-called stoplight coalition. The red, yellow, and green coalition in Germany is pretty fundamentally unstable, and I think a high inflation rate would certainly attract some people who would like to defect from that coalition, and that could bring down the government. So you didn't ask one thing I was hoping you'd ask, which was that there are ways to engineer supply shocks that are actually positive in the positive sense, and the Germans have actually just passed a reduced rate ticket for the railways and the local transit system, which effectively rigs a deflationary shock to the price level. And they did this in the summer of early summer of 2022, and then they're going to do it again because it does help. And it's kind of a redistribution. It's kind of like, let's give people who use the mass transit system a big break and make people who pay taxes or future taxpayers pay for it by borrowing money. So this is something we could see in many dimensions. I think Pierre has some similar things going on in France. So they try to reduce key prices as a way of placating the political instability or the potential instability.
Pierre, you want to finish up for us and tell us about France and about politics being screwed up by inflation? Maybe. So
in France, there is also much uncertainty. So we have Macron, and so we have some populists, the well-known Le Pen, who was in the last election. And we're also the extreme left. But otherwise, there is not much at this stage. It's difficult to know who will rise. And so I think that these very populist forces are really pro-inflation. I mean, in their program, you have huge public expenditure and so on and so on. So I think it's not an advantage for them. I think it will provide some advantages for the center-right, which really criticizes the increase in debt, has done that for years. So it seems to be more consistent with being in line with giving more power to this group. But as you know, in politics, you can change your argument very quickly, and there is also much uncertainty. But this will be my view, that it will be more favorable to the center right, in between Le Pen and Macron.
All right, let me ask for a one-word answer to finish up with each of just one word, yes or no. Should one be optimistic about inflation? Yes or no? Pierre?
Yes.
Michael?
Yeah.
Harry, yes or no?
Yes on inflation, less on output and employment, but yes on inflation.
Okay. I find this somewhat surprising and quite gratifying to have these experts here. And for the first time in any interview I've ever done, I've had all three people I've talked to being optimistic. Gentlemen, Harry Holzer of Georgetown, Pierre Cahuc of Sciences Po, Michael Burda of Humboldt University, Berlin. Thank you guys very much for being here, and thanks for your insights.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for doing this, Dan.
Thank you.